Christianity is just a story. It's just a myth. Jesus is just a myth. That is the critique I hear most often charged at Christianity compared to any other critique today. And look, I have no problem if you disagree with Jesus and you say, yeah, I don't agree with Jesus' teaching here, but the critique that he was just a myth is a non-starter. And so what I'm going to do today is I'm going to handicap myself. I'm not going to use any Christian sources, any Christian historians, any Christian theologians, and just non-Christians. I'm going to prove that Jesus actually existed and that every major part of his life can be proved with non-Christian primary source documents from the 1st and 2nd century Roman Empire. Why is this important? Because we can prove with these historical accounts of people who did not follow him, people who cared nothing for him, just people reporting stuff that's happening in the Roman Empire, that Jesus was born in Nazareth, that he lived a virtuous life, he gained a following, he called and claimed himself to be the Christ, the one who would save the Jews from their bondage, and then he died on a cross, he was crucified by Pontius Pilate, and that after his death, he still retained a following, and it even grew. And I have to say why that's important now, and then I'll prove it. The reason that it's so important that Jesus retained his following after he died is because this is an honor-shame culture, and being crucified on a cross was the most shameful experience a human could endure in the Roman Empire. You were crucified as a criminal, you were publicly shamed, you were crucified naked, and yet somehow, some way, Jesus' followers continued to follow him after his death. That is hugely significant. It should have, and the Roman Empire would have thought that it would have squashed that rebellion in an instant and would have squashed that following in an instant because it disproved all of Jesus's claims when he was alive. And so I am going to prove all of these historical facts with non-Christian writings. And I'm going to link in the description below, I'm going to give the locations, the citations of every single one of these Roman, Jewish, and Syrian historians, philosophers, and writers, so that you can go and you can see and read them for yourself. And I'll explain each along the way why they're important. Let's jump right into it. So let's set the scene of the 1st century Roman Empire and why it's so important. Jesus was from Podunk, Nazareth. It would have never been known that Nazareth existed except for the fact that Jesus came from there and he became so popular. Not only that, but we have a very small portion of actual documents that were written from that period. And so the sample size that we have, it mentions Jesus multiple times. Roman historians don't even mention Pontius Pilate, the governor of Judea, for over 10 years. They only mention him once, and it's in the context of Jesus of Nazareth. And so Jesus is more popular and more important to these Roman historians than Pontius Pilate, one of their governors of Judea. And so the fact that he's mentioned at all, the fact that he's mentioned more than other governors and officials in the Roman Empire, and the fact that we only have a small sample size of the writings that would have been written in the 1st century tells us that, one, Jesus would have been mentioned in a lot more writings that we just don't have any documentation of because we only have a small sample size, but also that he was an incredibly influential person early on. There was no time for these myths to develop 100, 200, 300 years later. The historical accounts and the actual historical events are too closely linked for there to be any significant myth to develop. Let's look at the first example. We're going to look at Tacitus first. Tacitus, he was writing on the fire that Nero supposedly set. He set Rome on fire and then he blamed the Christians for it. And this was in 69 AD. And so Tacitus, he's a Roman historian and he's just writing based on this time period and what the general feeling about that situation was. And I'll read this quote and then I'll tell you why it's so important. So here we go. Therefore, to suppress the rumor, Nero fabricated scapegoats and inflicted the most elaborate tortures on those who were hated for their abominations and commonly called Christians. The originator of that name, Christ, had been executed under the rule of Tiberius by Pontius Pilate. Though temporarily repressed, this deadly superstition broke out again, not only in Judea, the source of the evil, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world converge and find a following. First, those who confessed were arrested. Then, based on their information, a vast multitude was convicted, not so much for the crime of arson as for the hatred of the human race. Mockery was added to their deaths. They were covered with the skins of wild animals and torn apart by dogs or nailed to crosses or set aflame and burned as nighttime illumination when daylight failed. Nero offered his gardens for the spectacle and held games in the circus, mixing with the crowd in the guise of a charioteer or standing in his chariot. Hence, even for criminals who deserved the extreme and exemplary punishment, pity arose, as it seemed they were destroyed not for the public good, but to satisfy the cruelty of one man. Okay, so let's talk about why this is so important to historians. It's a long quote. It's the longest quote of the video. First, he's clearly a non-Christian, and he's using non-Christian sources to cite this historical event. The reason I say he's non-Christian is because he's calling them evil. He's calling Christians evil. He's calling them they're against humanity because they don't agree with the typical polytheism of the time of the Roman Empire. They didn't worship the emperor like they were supposed to, and so historians were calling Christians evil at the time, even though they were being incredibly self-sacrificial. They were picking up starving babies on the street that other people left to die. Like, these Christians were morally good by our standards, but by their standards, they were wicked. Second, this is reporting on AD 69 that Jesus is already being titled as the Christ, that the Christ is leading the Christians. And so this is far too early, and we'll get to even earlier sources, but this is only 30 years after his death, and he's already, after a death on a cross, he's already being claimed as the King of the Jews, as the one who will save the Jews from their bondage. And as we'll look at in our next video when we'll look at Christian writings, the claim is not just that Jesus would save the Jews from their bondage, but actually the whole world. And that is very, very clearly being taught way before AD 69. But so here in AD 69, we see that Jesus is already labeled the Christ, that he was crucified by Pontius Pilate. This is all historical fact using non-Christian sources who are also using non-Christian sources to write their history. Next up is the historian Suetonius. Suetonius was writing about an even earlier point in history. He's writing about a riot that happened in Rome in AD 49, and he blames it on Christians. He blames it on Jews and Christian relations, and ultimately he blames it on Christ. Let me read this quote to you. He banished from Rome all the Jews who were continually making disturbances at the instigation of one Chrestus. That's Chrestus. Some have tried to deny that this is referring to Christ. They say, oh, this is just a name of a slave in that time or something like that, because it's misspelled in Latin. It's Latin for Christ, or it's not Latin for Christ. It's Christus instead of Christus, and Christus is with an I instead of an E in the English transliteration. But the reason that it is almost certainly a reference to Christ is, one, because there is no such name as Christus in the Roman Empire. You look in all the catacombs and then you look in all the historical accounts, you can't find a single name that's Christus. And second, they had a vulgar term for Christianity in that time, Christiani. And so if you shorten that, it would shorten correctly to Christus. And so this historian likely made a mistake because he wasn't, again, consulting Christian sources. And that's actually a claim for its authenticity, that it wasn't some Christian interloper who came in and added Christ later because it's spelt wrong. No Christian interloper would spell Christ wrong. But instead, it was a Roman historian who was simply shortening Christiani into Christus because he would have believed that Christiani was started by Christus instead of Christus. So it's just a one-letter spelling. It's clearly a reference to Christ. The reason this is important is because Christ is being blamed for a riot that happened in AD 49. This is not meaning that this historian is claiming that Jesus rose from the dead and started a riot. That's not the point. It's that his followers who were following this one named Christ is the real originator, the instigator of said riot. It was a riot surrounding a debate about Christianity and Judaism. So already this is 15 years after Jesus' death. He's already being declared as the Christ by people who don't even follow the religion, or he's being not declared as the Christ, but he's being labeled as having called himself and his followers calling him Christ. Hugely important because it's that early on that you already have Jesus being labeled the Christ. Nothing to do with Christian sources. Next up, we have Pliny the Young. So Pliny the Young, he's a governor in, I believe, Syria. I didn't write it down. I don't remember if it was northern Galilee or Syria. It's somewhere in the north. He was in a northern portion in like modern day northern Turkey. He was a governor and he's writing in 110 AD, and he's writing to Emperor Trajan during his reign. And what at first I won't read everything because there's a lot to it, but at first he asked Trajan, he says, how can I get these Christians to stop being Christians? How can I get them to stop worshiping their God? How can I get them to stop worshiping Jesus? And Trajan's reply is, oh, you've done everything right. Yeah, we have them try and worship other things. We try and have them deny the name of Christ. If they agree to worship other gods, or if they agree to denounce Jesus, you know you have them. But it's the ones who they refuse to worship anything but Jesus. Those are the ones you have to be worried about. And after that correspondence, then Pliny starts to simply explain the Christians' daily practices and what it looked like in that time frame, in that time period, for them to be a religious community. So let me read that briefly. That it was their habit on a fixed day, meaning Sunday, this is the new habit, to assemble before daylight and recite by turns a form of words to Christ as a God, to Christ as a god. That's hugely important. And that they bound themselves with an oath, not for any crime, but not to commit theft or robbery or adultery, nor to break their word, and not to deny a deposit when demanded. After this, they went on. It was their custom to separate and then meet again to partake of food, but food of an ordinary and innocent kind. So first, again, we see the name Christ applied to Jesus, and now we also see evidence of non-Christians viewing from the outside. They see that these Christians are actually worshiping Jesus. And I always have to harp on this. The reason that's so important that they're worshiping Jesus is because the core moral principle of the Old Testament, of the Hebrew scriptures, is to worship God alone. And so if these Christians, and there are always Jews in the mix, if they are worshiping Jesus and they are saying, we refuse to worship anything or anyone else, that itself is a divine claim. So even though these Roman writers like Pliny the Young, he's writing they worship Christ as a god. They don't know what God means in a monotheistic religion, and so he would be thinking in a polytheistic sense. But what the Christians are doing is wholly different from that. They, by their worship, are claiming that Jesus is the one and only God of the universe. It's a completely radical religion in that time, something that's never existed before, that people would worship a man as if he is the only true God. Not some demigod like worshiping Caesar or something like that, but the one true God. And you already have this being recognized and being observed by outside observers who have no dog in the fight of this kind of theology. They're just witnessing what they see, and what they see is people refusing to worship anyone but Jesus. And of course, we see their ethic, right? We see their commitment to not committing crimes, their commitment to eating ordinary food, to not overindulging in alcohol or in food sacrificed to idols or things like this. This is all exactly how the Bible depicts Christians. And so we see it from historical accounts that have nothing to do with the Bible. And it is confirming the Bible's account of things. So I actually do have one more Roman historian, Thallus. So Thallus is interesting because he was writing in 52 AD. What he wrote was about the crucifixion account of Jesus. This is so fascinating. So Christians claim, and the Bible claims, that when Jesus was crucified, darkness fell over the land, and there was darkness for 3 hours. In 52 AD, a Roman historian, not a Christian, is arguing, no, that wasn't because of Jesus' crucifixion. That was just because of an eclipse. And the reason we even have this account, so we don't have that document anymore that Thallus wrote, and he's arguing against this supernatural darkness that fell over Jesus' crucifixion for 3 hours. We don't have that directly. What we do have is we have a Christian historian, Africanus, who's quoting Thallus, and he's arguing against Thallus, saying, no, that's impossible because he died on Passover, and that was during a full eclipse. That argument actually doesn't matter. It's just the fact that Thallus in 52 AD felt like he had to argue against this. He even knew what Christians were saying in 52 AD, and he felt like he had to argue against it. So this Roman historian is hearing the debate about Jesus's crucifixion on the cross, and there was this supernatural darkness, and he wanted to enter into that discussion, which proves historically that it's historically reliable. Because if it wasn't historically reliable, there's no reason for him not to just deny Jesus as a whole. Say, this Jesus person didn't even exist. Why is this happening? No, Jesus person was crucified in Jerusalem, right outside Jerusalem. That didn't happen. There's no historical records of that. We have Roman archives. There's all sorts of stuff. This Pontius Pilate person, he didn't exist. He didn't say any of that. What he did say was, oh no, it couldn't have been supernatural darkness. It was just an eclipse. That's how he tried to explain away the situation. He couldn't deny the existence of Jesus, so he had to deny a different aspect of what Christians were saying. So that is why that historical account is so important. Again, it proves that Jesus was crucified by Pontius Pilate, and this is confirmed 20-some years after his death by another Roman historian. Now let's get to one Syrian author, a Syrian philosopher, and then lastly, we will look at Josephus, who most of you, if you've looked into this at all, people quote Josephus first. So I wanted to give you the evidence that a lot of people maybe don't talk about, and then put the nail in the coffin with Josephus, because it's a very holistic account of who Jesus was and what he did during his time alive. The Syrian philosopher Mara bar Serapion, he's somewhat more sympathetic towards Christianity, but you can tell he's still not a Christian because he equates Jesus with other wise men. Listen to this. What good did it do the Athenians to kill Socrates? For which deed they were punished with famine and pestilence? What did it avail the Samians to burn Pythagoras, since their country was entirely burned under sand in one moment? Or what did it avail the Jews to kill their wise king, since their kingdom was taken away from them from that time on? God justly avenged these 3 wise men. The Athenians died of famine, the Samians were flooded by the sea, the Jews were slaughtered and driven from their their kingdom, everywhere living in the dispersion. Socrates is not dead thanks to Plato, nor Pythagoras because of Hera's statue, nor is the wise king because of the new law which he has given. And so we see this is a non-Jew, or this is a non-Christian, and he is claiming that the whole point of Jesus was that he had a kingdom and that he was king. And so that's another claim that we have. That, oh, by the way, this was written in 73 AD. So he, as this Syrian philosopher, is looking back and he's equating Jesus as a great wise king who brought a new law, and likely the law of love that is explained throughout the New Testament. This idea that you should love your enemies as yourself, and you should be self-sacrificial towards other people, and that's actually the true route to happiness and things like that. And that no one exemplified that better than Jesus himself, who died for the sake of humanity. That's the law of love. So what did we just prove by looking only at Roman and Syrian writers, mostly historians, one philosopher? What did we prove? We proved that Jesus was a man, that he lived, that he actually lived, that he lived a virtuous life. We'll prove that a little bit better here in a second. That he claimed to be the Christ, and all of his followers claimed to be the Christ, that he was crucified by Pontius Pilate, and that after he died, he still had a huge number of followers that continued to spread. And so because they continue to spread, we have to ask ourselves, why did the crucifixion not squash the spread of Christianity when their leader was publicly shamed and the Roman Empire basically flexed and said, no, we are more powerful than you. Your teachings, they mean nothing because we can kill you in the most gruesome, horrific way. And then they threatened all Christians with that too. You saw in that other quote that they were literally, by 100 AD, they were mauling and torturing and feeding Christians to animals. They were tarring them. They were doing the most horrific things to Christians, yet it still spread. Why? And again, I'm not using any Christian sources to make these claims. This is all Roman and Syrian historians. So last one, let's look at Josephus. If you don't know who Josephus is, he was a Jewish historian. And one of the things he wanted to write in his Antiquities is he was writing a history of from the creation all the way to the fall of Jerusalem. And within that, he writes about Jesus, but he actually also writes about John the Baptist and James, Jesus's brother. And so he's honing in on how important Jesus is by also mentioning other people who were surrounding Jesus at the time. And so the first quote is, I don't know if it's the first quote chronologically, but the first one that we want to look at is he makes a claim about James, the brother of Jesus, the one called the Christ. And the reason this is important is because there's no added descriptors after that. There's no qualification that says, oh, Jesus of Nazareth, this, that, the other. He just says Jesus, the one called Christ, and he leaves it, which means he believes that it's already common knowledge to a lot of his readers that this Jesus person claimed to be Christ. And he's writing around 93, 94 AD. He is, again, this is a Jew. He never became a Christian. He did not claim to be a follower of Jesus or anything like that. He was just reporting what he thought was common knowledge. And so he didn't have to add any qualifiers about who this Jesus was. It was just James, the brother of Jesus, so-called Christ. Now, here's another one that according to Josephus, this is a kind of summary of Jesus's life, one paragraph. At this time, there was a man who was called Jesus. His conduct was good, and he was known to be virtuous. And many people from among the Jews and the other nations became his disciples. Pilate condemned him to be crucified, and he died. And those who had become his disciples did not abandon his discipleship. They reported that he had appeared to them 3 days after his crucifixion and that he was alive. Accordingly, he was thought to be the Messiah, concerning whom the prophets have related wonders, and the people of Christians named after him have not disappeared till this day. That is a lot of stuff that we've already gone over with the Roman historians, and a Jewish historian is affirming and confirming the exact same things. This man called Jesus, he existed. He was a good man, and he had virtuous conduct. Many people from the Jews and the nation, so this is Jews and Romans and people from all over who are following Jesus. It's not ethnically confined to one ethnic group. Pilate condemned him to be crucified. He did die, and those who became his disciples did not abandon their discipleship. So there were disciples immediately after he died, and they continued to be his disciples. It wasn't like it died off for 50 years and then it happened again. There was no break in following Jesus after his death. These disciples reported having seen Jesus appear to them 3 days after his death. Sound familiar? They all thought he was the Messiah, the Christ. The Messiah is just a Hebrew term for Christ. Messiah is anointed one, and it's that savior of the Jews. And in the New Testament, it's actually depicted more than that. It's as savior of the world. But the anticipation of the Jews was that the Messiah would come and save them militarily. And so the Messiah. And so Christians, to the time that he's writing, 92, 93, 94 AD, Christians have not disappeared. They continue to exist despite the persecution, despite all of the people trying to get them to stop stopped believing through threat of death and even death itself. And Christianity still persisted. As you can see, with just non-Christian historians who were either antagonistic and hated Christianity, or they were apathetic towards Christianity, they all report on a Jesus who existed and that the whole outline of his life can be proved from non-Christian sources. That's the data right there. That's what we have. And that is, if you include Christian writings, the ability to prove Jesus' existence is greater than someone like Caesar Augustus or Julius Caesar because of how much detailed historical writing we have about Jesus. And again, remember, this is just a small sample size of what was likely written in the first century Roman Empire. And so if we had all the documents that were written, which is obviously a fanciful idea, but if we did, we would expect that Jesus would have been mentioned a lot more. Since the small extant material that we do have, he's already mentioned this many times, we could expect that he would have been mentioned a lot more than that. And so he was a highly influential person who claimed to be the Christ of the Jews, the King of the Jews who would come to save them, and that he died, and his disciples believed in him even after he died, and they claimed that he rose from the dead from the beginning. There was no time for myth to develop. Period. Based on historical accounts that have no pro-Christian ideology, Jesus existed and that his followers claimed these things from the earliest on. He was not a myth. The stories of Jesus are not just stories. There is historical fact related to them. That only answers half the question, though. The other half of the equation is, can we believe what Christians wrote about Jesus? So we have this basic outline of Jesus's life, but can we actually reliably know who Jesus is based on all of the writings, including Christian writings, specifically Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John? But we cannot finally answer the question, can we know who Jesus really was, without answering that question first. And so that is going to be part 2 of this 2-part series, is can we trust what Christians have said about Jesus, and therefore can we really know the true Jesus from the first century? I'm looking forward to it. Thanks for watching, fools. See you next time.